Thank you, Mr. Evans. I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Wood Green for securing this important debate. She also pointed out the scourge, I think, of the misuse of social media and the internet. And I know actually a further Amnesty International report on precisely that, which I think identifies that those most at risk of social media, whether through Twitter or Facebook elsewhere, tend to be women who are abused in this way, as a way of trying to silence them. And she rightly points out the unacceptable situation facing the Right Honourable Lady for Hackney North and Stoke Newington, by no means uniquely, but I think unique in terms of the sheer volume of that abuse, which is something that I know is actually a focus, I'm sure, of a further long debate. And I think all the concerns that we all have about the idea of regulating and putting too many compliance upon the internet, we do believe, and rightly believe, that it is an element of a free society, but equally the shocking level of abuse that unfortunately has coarsened so much of political debate and will continue to do so unless there is some sort of code, whether it is a voluntary or other code in that regard. But as I say, that probably is an issue for further debate, but I think it reflects the challenges that human rights defenders, particularly female human rights defenders, find themselves under. May I also say I'm very grateful for the contributions made by other honourable members who I think have very eloquently described the impact of women human rights defenders locally, nationally and internationally. And I should like really to begin, if I may, with a quote from a human rights defender that goes, in my view, to the very heart of this debate. It came from Sarah Landeros, who was one of a number of women human rights defenders whom the Foreign and Commonwealth Office profiled on social media only last year to mark the then 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders and to give them a platform to talk about their work. Mrs. Leandros' organisation provides legal representation for persecuted human rights defenders in Mexico. And she said, as a defender, you don't have the right to give up. When you are defending victims, you have to be strong. If they, as victims, have not stopped, then you have to keep going for them. And it's that kind, I think, of selfless commitment and dedication that lies behind everything that human rights defenders do, day in and day out, as they work tirelessly to defend the rights of others, often those others, of course, being voiceless within society. And often, of course, they have, by their very nature, to operate in the most difficult of environments. Not only that, but by exposing issues that the powerful would prefer to keep hidden, their work, of course, puts them in constant danger. They or their families can face discrimination, violence, and even at the very worst, death. That, of course, is what happened to Berta Cáceres. She bravely stood up for the rights of an indigenous group in Honduras against an hydroelectrical dam project that was being proposed. She paid for that with her life. It has taken 5 years for those responsible to be held to account. And tragically, of course, Berta's own murder, her own circumstances, by no means unique. Many others have been killed for standing up against those in power. Many others today face similar threats. In some cases, the threats that women face are the same as their male counterparts, from surveillance and false accusations to physical threat. For example, we are deeply concerned, and I'll come on to this if I may, it was brought up by the Honourable Lady for North Ayrshire and Arran, and actually indeed by the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Wood Green, the issue around Saudi women activists who have found themselves being detained. The British government, including the Prime Minister herself, has lobbied consistently in the cases of women human rights defenders currently in detention in Saudi Arabia for them to be given due process, for the allegations of torture to be properly, fully, publicly and independently investigated, and for those responsible for any alleged abuse to be prosecuted. British Embassy officials have and will continue to request to observe each and every trial session, and unfailingly, quietly behind the scenes, will advocate for the importance of the right of freedom of speech and the right to a fair trial. Sadly, many of these women remain in jail, facing unclear charges. However, of course, women are also exposed to risks by virtue of being women, from sexual abuse and harassment, as has been mentioned by many in this debate, to domestic abuse and hostility in the workplace. In these circumstances, it takes, of course, even more courage, even more strength, and even more resilience to stand up to the powerful.
Thank the Minister for accepting an intervention. And what is the proposed action if Saudi Arabia does not comply with the discussions in the back channels, which are correct and are part of diplomacy, but we are facing a crisis now? And what is it that could be done differently in order to promote a just solution, not just for women, but for all of those who are facing human rights abuses in Saudi, with whom we do so much business?
Let me, if I may, say a little more about that in a later passage. And I appreciate that, and I think hopefully the Honourable Lady will appreciate that it's probably not the right place on the floor of the House to make up policy on the hoof, but clearly there have been, there are grave concerns, and I will perhaps try to ensure that I write to her in due course to talk through some of the steps that we intend to take in this regard. I just wanted to maybe returning to what I was saying earlier on, that I think we can all be proud to see that a lot of women do stand up day after day, providing time and again that their words and their work have a real impact in righting wrongs and creating a more equal and just society. It's why I believe it's right that we honour them with this debate today, and why unequivocally this government, and I'm sure all of the House, would unequivocally support them. Protecting and promoting human rights is a cornerstone of our work in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and does often engaging in quite difficult conversations, both publicly and often privately, with a variety of governments with whom we have strong diplomatic relationships. I think we're very fortunate to work with and support courageous women like Rebecca Guillaume in Tanzania, who succeeded in raising the legal age of marriage for both boys and girls in that country. In recognition of her work, she's been awarded the United Nations Prize in the field of human rights. Still hard at work in Tanzania, working with the British High Commission there. In Jakarta, in Indonesia, we've used our Achieving Alumni Programme fund to raise awareness amongst young people about sexual harassment, and the project implementer is a former Achieving Scholar, now a prominent human rights defender and lawyer who focuses particularly on gender and equality. She and tens of thousands of other women human rights defenders around the world dedicate their time and their efforts and their energy to helping others, and they deserve our gratitude and support. Throughout 2019, the UK will increase the transparency of our support for human rights champions like them. And we will also do so with like-minded partners around the globe to support and uphold human rights. They may be other governments, they may be NGOs and others, of course.
For giving way. I think we've all agreed that we have concerns about how Saudi Arabia treats women and all human rights defenders in that country. Given that we're aware of the barbarity of the Saudi regime, and notably the Saudi regime also appears to have no qualms about bombing innocent civilians in the Yemen, is he comfortable with the UK position of continuing to sell arms to such a bloodthirsty regime?
The situation in Yemen, of course, is far more complicated than perhaps she had put into place. I mean, obviously, I could rehearse the issue that has survived, that has resulted in that civil war in that country. There is, as she's also well aware, the most rigorous of arms control codes that this government, and indeed all UK governments over the past 20 years have adhered to. It's something that all of us as ministers take extremely seriously, and I can assure her that there are opportunities, and indeed there is a challenge and indeed a responsibility on all of us as government ministers in signing off any arms sales to ensure that there are very strict criteria both in UK law and of course in international law to which we adhere. May I just return to what I was saying? When we talk about our bilateral work, we will also work, of course, multilaterally through the UN, and the UK will work with partners to strengthen the resolve of the international community to support women human rights defenders. A year ago, we committed some £1.6 million to support efforts to get more women participating in peace processes as mediators and peace builders across the Commonwealth. And the Honourable Lady who speaks for the Labour Party from the Honourable Lady for Hayward Middleton, I think was very right to suggest that this was an important part of this process, something the UN, through its Security Resolution 1325, is continually aware of, trying to raise as much interest across the globe to bring female advocates to make a real difference in this regard. But I also think it means continuing to work with the many thousands of non-governmental organisations that share our human rights values and objectives, and a number have been referred to in the course of this debate. They are the experts, it's their expertise and passion that, alongside governments, helps to deliver change. They also support the human rights defenders on the front line of human rights. And we are very actively supporting women's political participation because, again, we recognise that that empowerment gives women the opportunity to share their views, challenge the status quo and make informed decisions. And that's why women's empowerment is at the heart of the Department for International Development's latest strategic vision for gender equality, which it launched last year. That strategic vision aims to build up gender equality from the ground up through education, employment and empowerment of women and girls, including in conflict, crises and humanitarian emergencies. Mr. Evans, I wanted, if I may, just to touch on one or two of the specific points that were brought up in the debate, and please forgive me if I haven't fully answered it, and I will again do so in writing if necessary. In response to the request by the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Wood Green, she asked when the government intends to publish the UK guidelines on working with human rights defenders. These guidelines are an internal document to help diplomatic staff in our embassies and high commissions support human rights defenders. We've worked with NGOs to update these guidelines. Lord Ahmed agreed in December, as was rightly pointed out, to make UK support for human rights defenders more transparent. We do intend to publish a document setting out the UK's support for human rights defenders in 2019, again in consultation with NGOs. So I think we will hopefully have something published within the next few months. I'm sure that the Honourable Lady will remind me of this again later in the year if we haven't had a final publication. I think all members will appreciate that for some, we will be as transparently as we can, but obviously part of that toolkit involves sensitive discussions, and therefore perhaps not entirely wise to, at all times, to publish all the rules and regulations in their entirety. I know I'm going to be facing the Honourable Gentleman for Leeds North West again tomorrow with the debate that my Honourable friend for Witney has secured in relation to West Papua. I know it's something that's very close to his heart, and I would not in any way wish to belittle it. I know he has been very passionate about this, unfortunately in his pre-parliamentary days and from there on in, as he has made clear. And I hope that will give an opportunity to cover the situation in depth tomorrow. But he made some powerful points about particular human rights defenders in West Papua and female human rights defenders at that. I must confess I have nothing specific in addition to the Honourable Lady for Glasgow Central's point, but I will, of course, undertake to pass on the particular concerns which I think she recognised were more Home Office concerns, but I will pass on to my right honourable friend, the Minister for Immigration, and try to get that sorted out. May I also say, just on a slightly personal point, given we have a little bit of time on these matters, she may well be aware that one of my great British political heroes is Andrew Bonar-Law, who was, of course, a member for Glasgow Central. And I'm sure he would also be very proud. He was actually, ironically, at a time, of course, when the great debate just over 100 years ago in this House was about women's rights to vote, he was actually quite a liberal on that matter, albeit as a Conservative Prime Minister. But he, of course, was the member for Glasgow Central in a day when it was a safe Conservative seat. I think the business vote had something to do with it in those days. But, of course, she is the very first, but the first, I'm sure, of many female members of Parliament for that great historic seat in the centre of that great Scottish city. Can I just say a little bit, if I may, about Saudi Arabia? I did promise to do so to both the Honourable Lady for Hornsey and Wood Green and for North Ayrshire and Arran, and I will come back, as I say, if there are some more specific points that I can raise. I was asked what actions the UK government was taking in regard to the continued detention of women's human rights defenders. We are concerned about the continuing detention of women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia, and as I have said, we are monitoring that situation closely. Those concerns are raised consistently, and were, I know, by both the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary in dealing with the Saudi authorities at the highest level. And I will, again, make similar representations, obviously, as the Honourable Lady may be aware. I am the interim Minister also now for Middle East and North Africa, and I will endeavour to do so in future conversations with the Saudi ambassador to London. Those concerns have also been raised through the UN system. The UK was a signatory to the joint statement published at the UNHCR, HRC rather, on the 7th of March this year, which expressed significant concerns about the situation. And we are deeply concerned about the allegations of torture and have raised this directly with the Saudi authorities. Saudi Arabia remains a Foreign and Commonwealth Office human rights priority country, particularly because of the use of the death penalty, its restrictions and clamping down on women's rights, as well as on broader issues around freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion and belief. I just wanted also to touch on a point that was raised by the Honourable Lady for Hayward and Middleton, asking about business and human rights and what we're doing to better human rights practices. We are committed in our work to focusing on, through the promotion of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And she's quite right, obviously, to identify also the importance that we rightly attach to the issues around SDGs 5 and 16 in particular. But we also wish to utilise as many of the diplomatic skills as we can in relation to legislative and non-legislative measures to protect against and provide remedies for human rights abuses by business. The UK was very proud to be the first country in the world to produce a national action plan responding to the UN's guiding principles on this matter, and we have since encouraged other states to draft their own national action plans. We were also the first country to produce an update to our plan in 2016. We regard these guiding principles really as being the authoritative global standard for preventing and addressing the risks of adverse human rights impacts on business, and will continue to promote those principles. Mr. Evans, thank you so much for giving me a little bit more leeway in time. We have a little bit of time on our hands, and I think it is also fair to say that whilst this debate will not fully go through its full 90 minutes, I don't think there's any lack of passion, particularly for all of those here. And I think, as the Honourable Lady rightly pointed out, I think having a debate on the first day back after a recess when people are trying to make their way back down to London reflects in the quantity, if not the quality, of the debate that we've had. I think we've had also some very practical examples today of the ways in which women's human rights defenders can and do transform lives. It's why I think we should all be proud that the UK remains committed to helping women all over the world feel safe and protected in the work that they do, so they're able to speak very freely and to be part of the change that we all wish to see. I know I speak not just for the FCO, but I hope for everyone in Parliament when I say that we want to see a world in which all people are treated with fairness and with dignity. We want a world in which those fighting to improve human rights can do so without fear of discrimination, violence, or retaliation. And so let us take all of our inspiration from women like Sarah Landeros. If she is determined to keep fighting and keep fighting on for that better world, then we also must do the same. And that, I know, is what this government, and I'm sure this Parliament, is very committed to doing.